Dear friends, welcome once again in the live interactive teleconference of PGDCC program. In fact, we are doing this teleconference after a gap of 2 months, that is December and January. We have started because we have received lot of queries from student side and from experts all over the country, and they have requested us to continue these sessions. It is very useful for them. And this is the reason I ask all of you to give the proper feedback. What are the topic you want to read? What are the topic you want discussions in this forum? Please let me know so that we can arrange the sessions accordingly. Today we are going to discuss two topics. First topic will be pulmonary embolism, and second topic will be etiopathogenesis of acute coronary syndrome. Before going to the topic, I would like to have few administrative and administrative related announcement. First of all, I would like to say that result of the first year student will be available within the March 2008. Examination for the second year student, that is MCC 005, 6 and 7, that is theory, term and examination, will be conducted in the month of June. Most probably you will get the date and examination form need to be filled up in the month of March or April. The practical examination for the second year students will be conducted after the completion of 2 years training, and the date and venue will be informed to you very shortly. Most probably the date will be within the month of June and July, depending upon the flexibility of the program study center. And there is one more thing I would like to say is this program is also available on the DTH, direct to home TV. So you can just ask your friends or your relative wherever DTH service is available to ask to check whether this program is available or not, so that next time onward you can sit at your own home and see this program. I am not very much sure that whether it is available on the Dish TV or not, but still you can check, and next time onward you can sit at your home and you can see this program. Now coming to the topic, that is pulmonary embolism or pulmonary thromboembolism. It is a condition when venous thrombi become dislodged from their sites of formation and they embolize to the pulmonary arterial circulation, or paradoxically to the arterial circulation through a patent foramen ovale. About half of the patients with the pelvic vein thrombosis or proximal deep leg vein thrombosis have pulmonary thromboembolism, which is usually asymptomatic. But it is not asymptomatic all the time. Pulmonary thromboembolism can have symptoms also. It may be severe form or it may be even death also. In the pulmonary thromboembolism can have the following effects, that is, after having that embolism, that once it is lodged into the pulmonary arterial circulation, it can increase the pulmonary vascular resistance, it impairs the gas exchange, it impairs the pulmonary functions, and it increases the airway resistance, and alveolar hyperventilation also occurs. I am not expert in this topic. To discuss this entire topic, we have got experts from Fortis Noida Hospital, and we are very happy to have Dr. Binit Bhatia. Welcome, sir, in our studio.
Thanks a lot.
In fact, for your kind information, I would like to say this program is lively telecast across the India wherever our regional center is there, as well as all the DTH facility. So our students are viewing us, and they can also ask our questions by phone or by fax. Dr. Binit Bhatia is DM cardiologist, and right now he is working in Fortis Noida Hospital, and he is our program in charge in that center. So I would like to request Dr. Binit Bhatia to start with this topic.
Good morning everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Biplav for having given me this opportunity today to come to this wonderful place at IGNOU and give a talk on pulmonary embolism. Pulmonary embolism is I think one of the most misdiagnosis which is often overlooked and can have catastrophic consequences. So it's very important that all residents, especially our PGDCC students, should read up this topic very well, and they should have a high index of suspicion for patients who present with symptoms and signs which we shall be discussing subsequently, so that this diagnosis is not missed. This diagnosis, if missed, can have high associated mortality, and the treatment results are also quite drastic. So recognition of this condition is very important, and often diagnosis can be made within the casualty itself if immaculate clinical investigation is done. So coming to the topic now, if you could have the slides on, please. It was in fact way back in 1856 when Rudolf Virchow first came together with what is now famously known as Virchow's triad. Basically, three things should act in concert which in turn lead to intravascular coagulation. These are local trauma to the vessel wall, hypercoagulable state, and stasis. When these three act in concert, intravascular coagulation occurs, and this is the genesis of formation of a clot which subsequently embolizes to the pulmonary tree, leading to pulmonary embolism. The site of formation of these clots is invariably, as Dr. Biplav had earlier mentioned, in the lower extremities, most commonly in the deep venous system of the legs. However, embolization can also occur from the upper extremity and give rise to subsequent pulmonary thromboembolism. Now, as one of the components of hypercoagulable states, it is very important that we see what are the different genetic mutations which can lead to a primary hypercoagulable states. Perhaps the most important and talked about is the factor V gene mutation, which is also known as factor V Leiden, in which there is replacement of arginine at position number 506 by glutamine, which renders factor V resistant to inactivation by activated protein C. Amongst the others, much talked about hypercoagulable states, important are resistance to activated protein C, prothrombin gene mutation, mutation in protein C gene, protein S deficiency, antithrombin 3 deficiency, hyperhomocystinemia, and the much important antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. The antiphospholipid antibody syndrome carries special significance because not only is it associated with pulmonary embolism, it is also associated with recurrent fetal loss, arterial and venous thromboembolism. The target INRs, as we shall be discussing subsequently, are required to be kept much high in antiphospholipid antibody syndrome as compared to the other primary hypercoagulable states. Another important aspect that we have to remember is that once a patient has been suspected to have pulmonary embolism, often there is a knee-jerk reaction and we just give a dose of heparin or some other anticoagulant or some antiplatelets within the casualty itself. In case we want to evaluate our patients for these hypercoagulable states, it is best advisable to take the sample of blood for these parameters before the patient is given any form of anticoagulation. So this should be planned well in advance. It should not be that we have given the heparin and then subsequently we plan to do these primary coagulable state studies, because in that case it's usually not possible. Now, coming to the various acquired conditions which usually lead to venous thrombosis, long haul air travel is an important entity, and it is also known as economy class syndrome. It is usually found to be occurring in patients who undertake transatlantic air travel. We ourselves at our hospital in the last 1 year have come across 3 patients who had taken non-stop flights from America to India and landed up with the deep vein thrombosis and subsequently pulmonary thromboembolism. We have a few dedicated slides to this condition also. The other condition is surgery, immobilization or trauma, hospitalization with medical illnesses such as congestive heart failure or pneumonia. In fact, these two conditions, number 2 and 3, are basically conditions which lead to prolonged immobilization, as a result of which the patient is often bedridden, and the stasis will occur at that time, and this is one of the components of the Virchow's triad. The other factors are obesity, smoking, systemic arterial hypertension, diabetes mellitus. Oral contraceptive pills, pregnancy and postpartum state are all known to be associated with venous thrombosis. In fact, they say that pregnancy is a hypercoagulable state. Cancers, especially occult adenocarcinomas, are known to be associated with venous thrombosis, and once a patient has been started on chemotherapy, also the chances of one developing venous thrombosis are much higher. Stroke and spine surgery, often associated with prolonged immobilization, again one of the common causes for causing venous thrombosis. Indwelling catheters, pacemakers, and implantable cardioverter defibrillators are also known to be associated with the development of the thrombosis. The most common site in pacemakers and ICDs are usually the site of excess is the subclavian. So it's in the subclavian that some form of clotting might take place, which subsequently would embolize into the lung through the superior vena cava route. So these are the conditions in which usually upper extremity is responsible for subsequent pulmonary thromboembolism, and hence due cognizance has to be given to that.
Yeah, sir. Before going to the some other topic, may I just know that prolonged immobilization, you said one of the risk factor for this means pulmonary thrombosis. Is it the only prolonged immobilization, or prolonged immobilization cause other things which precipitate the deep vein thrombosis and which is going on in another way?
Right. Actually, once the patient is on prolonged immobilization, patient is usually bedridden for a long time. And often people are so much interested in looking at other things, that certain basic things like giving elastic stockings to the patient, or giving them a prophylaxis usually with low molecular heparin is usually overlooked. And it is the prolonged immobilization and the stasis of the blood within the deep venous system which gives rise to such problems. Especially patients have got trauma which is involving the lower limb, or they have a hemiparesis, then that particular limb is being used less. So the stasis is more in that particular limb, and that is where usually there is a site of the formation of a clot. Once the clotting has occurred, it just keeps on getting propagated, and the clot burden becomes higher and higher. And subsequently it would start extending into the iliac veins, and then up into into the inferior vena cava, and subsequently one odd day one part could just embolize and get into the pulmonary tree and cause a lot of problems. Now coming to some other important facts, as far as oral contraceptive pills are concerned, fatal pulmonary thromboembolism occurs 1 in 1 lakh women years use of oral contraceptive pills. Hormone replacement therapy has been shown to be of has also been shown to be detrimental, especially estrogen and progesterone combination doubles the risk of one developing deep venous thrombosis and subsequently pulmonary thromboembolism. One more astonishing fact that comes to light is that if a patient has got a pulmonary embolism or a deep venous thrombosis, and where you find that there is no obvious cause, if you evaluate these patients for carcinomas, in fact the chances of your finding a carcinoma are 2 to 3 times much higher as compared to a normal individual. So if you have any patient in which you have pulmonary embolism or DVT in which there is no explainable cause, look for an occult cancer, and invariably you might pick up. But the unfortunate part is this, that although you have made the diagnosis, the cancer is usually in an advanced stage and carries a very poor prognosis. Now, once the embolization has occurred, the embolization could be mild, it could be moderate, or it could be severe. Now, if there is a severe pulmonary embolism, what is the pathophysiology of the whole process? Once pulmonary embolism takes place, there are basically two types of problems which are occurring. One is the anatomical obstruction because of the clot present within either the main pulmonary artery or the side branches, and second are the neurohumoral effects, which occur chiefly because of release of certain substances from the platelets like serotonin. Once there is anatomical obstruction or neurohumoral effects, there is an increase in the pulmonary artery pressure, there is an increase in the RV afterload. All these lead to RV dilatation and dysfunction. Subsequently, there is a fall in the right ventricular output, causing a total fall in the amount of the blood which is reaching the left ventricle also. Similarly, once the RV gets overloaded, the septum gets pushed towards the left side and thereby further compromises the filling of the LV. These two together go to decrease the RV preload, the left ventricular output falls, and patient lands in systemic hypoperfusion. These sequence of events are most commonly found to be occurring when we have a moderately severe or a large amount of pulmonary embolism, such that more than 50% of the pulmonary vasculature has got obstructed. Do these cascading events come into place? Similarly, once there is increase in RA and in PA and RV afterload, there is increase in the RV wall tension, the right ventricular oxygen demand increases, and since there is a decrease in the RV oxygen supply, coronary perfusion also falls, and this might be one of the reasons for severe chest pain also, which is often found to be occurring in pulmonary thromboembolic patients, and this further adds to hypotension, and a vicious cycle is set in. And in patients, if this goes unrecognized, this can be fatal too. Now coming to the symptoms of pulmonary thromboembolism, often the symptoms can be very subtle. As we had already mentioned, you have to have a very high index of suspicion. One of the largest registries of pulmonary thromboembolism has been the ICOPER, which is International Cooperative Pulmonary Embolism Registry, which analyzed more than around 2,500 patients of pulmonary thromboembolism. And this study was published in Lancet in 1999, in which it was found that the most common symptom of patients of pulmonary thromboembolism was dyspnea, found to be occurring in more than 80% of cases, tachypnea, found to be occurring in approximately 60%, tachycardia 40%, chest pain, again important symptom, in more than 50%. So in fact, this is what patients coming with sudden onset breathlessness and with chest pain, often the symptom of often you would suspect that it is a acute coronary syndrome which is occurring. So it's very important that we keep the entire the clinical scenario of the patient in mind. Patients often also present with cough. Patients can present with syncope. Syncope is more common when there is a massive pulmonary embolism and causes sudden fall in the cardiac output. Hemoptysis, usually a feature of not a pulmonary thromboembolism but a pulmonary infarction. Now, what are the syndromes of pulmonary embolism? Pulmonary embolism has been broadly classified into presenting as 6 syndromes. They are massive, moderate to large, small to moderate, pulmonary infarction, paradoxical embolism, and non-thrombotic embolism. Massive pulmonary embolism, usually patients present with breathlessness, syncope and cyanosis with persistent systemic arterial hypotension. As already discussed, more than 50% of the pulmonary vascular obstruction occurs in patients who present with massive PE. RV dysfunction on 2D echocardiography is a common feature. The therapy in these cases, you need to initiate treatment very fast. You give intravenous heparin followed by a thrombolytic therapy or a mechanical intervention. The second syndrome is a moderate to large pulmonary embolism. These patients usually have normal systemic arterial blood pressure, and typically more than 30% of a perfusion defect is found on the lung scan. RV dysfunction again is a feature of moderate to large. So RV dysfunction, if found on the 2D echocardiography, either indicates that it is a more than a moderate pulmonary embolism, and such patients should be treated with heparin plus minus thrombolytic therapy or a mechanical intervention. The most common presentations are usually small to moderate. Such patients usually have normal arterial blood pressure. RV dysfunction on echo is absent, and the treatment for such patients is heparin. Now coming to pulmonary infarction, this is another syndrome of pulmonary embolism in which patients typically present with pleuritic chest pain, hemoptysis, pleural rub, or evidence of lung consolidation. Typically these emboli are usually very small and they would embolize into the periphery of the lung, and RV dysfunction again is rare. Heparin as well as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs form the main form of treatment. Paradoxical embolism, Dr. Biplab again had just touched upon the topic. This is sudden systemic embolism and the patient lands up with an event such as a stroke. Now this is often also discussed as a case of a cryptogenic stroke, where a stroke has been caused but there is no obvious cause of embolism. Usually young patients presenting with stroke, you go on and evaluate them for hypercoagulable states, for any obvious LV clots, and for premature atherosclerosis. Usually you don't find anything. Such patients usually have got paradoxical embolism. That means the thrombotic material has passed from the right sided circulation across a patent foramen ovale from the right atrium to the left atrium, and then has gone into the systemic circulation. So this is what is called paradoxical embolism. It can be easily picked up on a transesophageal echogram. Contrast echocardiography often helps to detect a PFO. I shall be showing you some diagrams later on which will help us to understand this event of paradoxical embolism. RV dysfunction again is rare, and anticoagulation plus minus closure of the right to left shunt, cardiac shunt can be done. As far as non-thrombotic embolism is concerned, most commonly air embolism. Venous air embolism can occur during placement of indwelling catheters, during placement of central venous lines. One has to be very careful. It can be fatal. Fat embolism can occur. This is more common in patients who have undergone some form of trauma or orthopedic surgery. Tumor fragments can embolize, and amniotic fluid embolism can occur following the parturition. As far as air embolism is concerned, it's important that once the air embolism has been diagnosed, the patient should be placed in the it should be placed in the Trendelenburg position, and the patient should be given the left lateral position, because this helps to trap the air at the RV apex and prevents the air from entering into the pulmonary tree. At the same time, the patient should be put in a hyperbaric chamber, because that will help to absorb the oxygen out of the RV, and other supportive medication should be given. But such hyperbaric air chambers are usually not available in India. So the best way is to be very careful at the time of central venous cannulation and not to keep the IV access port too much exposed to air, because this unwanted event can be prevented if due care is given. Now, what is the differential diagnosis of a pulmonary thromboembolism? Unless you have a high index of suspicion, you are going to miss the diagnosis. Patients can be, because patient would be presenting with breathlessness, with chest pain, and you would suspect that patient has got acute coronary syndrome or a myocardial infarction. Here an ECG will be very helpful to you, and rapid bedside test using something like a troponin T would be very much beneficial. Pneumonia, again chest X-ray will be highly suggestive. Patient will be having fever, patient would have signs of consolidation like a bronchial breathing. Congestive heart failure, left-sided failure, again presenting with sudden onset breathlessness, but in such cases patients would have bilateral crepitations, patient would be bringing out pink frothy sputum, and patient could have hemoptysis sort of a condition. And you know that hemoptysis if occurs in a pulmonary thromboembolic setting is usually with pulmonary infarction, and those are usually small. They won't cause the patient to be so sick. Moreover, you could also do a BNP, which could help you to come at the diagnosis when you would know that all pulmonary causes could be ruled out. So there are several conditions which could be missed as a pulmonary embolism. Amongst others are cardiomyopathy, primary pulmonary hypertension, asthma, pericarditis, intrathoracic cancers, rib fractures, pneumothorax, costochondritis, musculoskeletal and plain anxiety. So have a high index of suspicion, examine the patient properly, and you are not going to miss the diagnosis. Now, what are the various diagnostic modalities which are available to us? They could be, I think, broadly classified into two categories, as non-imaging modalities and as imaging modalities. Among the non-imaging modalities, important are the electrocardiogram, the plasma D-dimer, and the ABG. The ABG is a matter of contention here, and we shall discuss this in greater detail, because ABG is invariably often thought of as a very important diagnostic modality in pulmonary thromboembolism, although it is not so. Amongst the imaging modalities, chest X-ray, echocardiogram, very, very important. Echocardiogram plays an important role. Newer techniques like CT chest, very helpful. Lung scans are often undertaken but not very popular now. MRI scans, very helpful, but the only problem is its availability 24 hours round the clock, and pulmonary angiograms, although the gold standard, now obsolete because it's an invasive form of an investigation. Now coming to ECG, any patient presenting with chest pain to your emergency department should have an ECG done within 5 minutes. That is the first thing. No doubt, if the patient is in hemodynamic compromise, you should do other resuscitative measures, but it's important that if things are fine, an ECG be in place within 5 minutes. Because in pulmonary thromboembolism, ECG changes are present in almost 90% cases. Most commonly, however, it is just plain simple sinus tachycardia. Patient could have an incomplete or a complete right ventral branch block. He could have a S in lead 1 and AVL of more than 1.5 millimeters. The transition zone is shifted to lead V5 rather than lead V3. QS in leads 3 and AVF but not in lead 2. A QRS axis, that is rightward, that means more than 90 degrees or an indeterminate axis, is often found to be occurring in massive pulmonary thromboembolism. Low limb lead voltages and T inversions in 3 AVF, V1 to V4. If you read the textbooks of cardiology, they often refer the ECG in pulmonary thromboembolism to be S1, Q3 and T3. So if you see this slide, there is S in 1, Q in 3 and T, S1, Q3 and T3. T is inverted in lead 3. And the other important thing is that there is T inversion also in the anterior chest leads V1 to V4. Now, this is one ECG of a patient who has come with acute cor pulmonary falling thromboembolism. I picked it up from Grunwald's textbook of cardiology. Classically, a patient is in normal sinus rhythm. and has sinus tachycardia. Heart rate here is almost reaching up to say about 150. There is a SN1, there is a QN3, and there is a T inversion in lead 3. So S1, Q3, T3 pattern has been met. There is T inversion in V1, V2, V3, V4 and a poor R wave progression. If the S1, Q3, T3 is overlooked here, one could think that there is a QS pattern in V1, V2, there is a poor R wave in V3, V4. So maybe the patient is having some interoceptal myocardial infarction. So the S1, Q3, T3 should be looked for, and a simple bedside test like a cardiac enzyme will be very helpful. Just get the echocardiogram to the emergency department, which is often available. Look for regional wall motion abnormality if it is present, and you will clinch the diagnosis immediately. Now this is an ECG from one of the patients who presented over casualty. Again classical signs, sinus tachycardia, patient has the right axis. There is again an S1, Q3, T3, and there is an incomplete RBBB with T inversion in V1, V2, V3, V4. In fact, this patient was diagnosed to have pulmonary embolism just on ECG basis. This patient had landed up to us from Canada by air. He landed up with chest pain in the aircraft, and patient has been treated as a case of acute coronary syndrome at the airport and is referred to us. And in fact, it was one of our PGDCC students who has picked up the diagnosis on the ECG. So fantastic ECG, really helpful. So please give very due respect to the ECG and it plays a very important role. Now coming to the plasma D-dimer, nowadays several companies have come up with beautiful kits which are available to make rapid bedside diagnosis. The plasma D-dimer has got very high sensitivity, more than 90%, but the only thing is that the specificity is low because it can be found to be elevated in several other conditions. It can be assayed with monoclonal antibodies and has a very high negative predictive value. This means that if you have a patient who is supposing say post-op, patient is bedridden, and now patient presents with sudden onset breathlessness. Now one would say that elevated D-dimer could also be present post-op for 1 week. Now if this patient has got an elevated D-dimer, it could either be pulmonary embolism or it could be because of post-op. But if you have a negative D-dimer, then you have surely ruled out pulmonary thromboembolism. So it has got a very high negative predictive value. Unfortunately, there are several other conditions in which D-dimer could be elevated, like myocardial infarction, sepsis, cancers, systemic illnesses, and as we already mentioned, post-op within the first week. The D-dimer has been produced because of the clot per se. The fibrinolytic mechanisms are acting and they are breaking down the fibrin fragments and creating D-dimer. So basically you are taking the sample from the blood, you are putting the antibody, and you just means picking it up on the bedside. Now acid blood gas analysis, another often overused investigation in pulmonary thromboembolism, but we have to remember the fact that the PIOPED study, that is a prospective investigators of pulmonary embolism diagnosis, major big trial published in the Journal of American Medical Association, has clearly shown that ABG has no definite role in the diagnostic workup of pulmonary thromboembolism. Because in the PIOPED it was found that the partial pressure of oxygen did not discriminate the presence or absence of pulmonary thromboembolism. The partial pressure of oxygen in pulmonary thromboembolism was found to be 70, and patients who had no pulmonary thromboembolism around 72. 26% of patients who had pulmonary thromboembolism had more than 80 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen on ABG. So not a very important thing, but often done. No harm in doing it, but it should not be given too much significance. Now coming to chest X-ray, another very important investigation. However, chest X-ray is normal in more than 50% cases. Since the blood flow has got obstructed to a particular lobar segment, you can have focal oligemia, cardiomegaly, another important sign because the RA-RV has got dilated, so you will have cardiomegaly. You can have a peripheral wedge opacity above the diaphragm, which is called the Hampton's hump. This is more commonly with pulmonary infarctions. You can have a collapse of the lung, which is called atelectasis. You can have focal infiltrates, and you could have pleural effusions. Now this is an X-ray of a patient again picked up from Braunwald's textbook, in which there is a Hampton's hump, or there is a wedge-shaped opacity which is present above the diaphragm here. Now coming to venous ultrasound, important investigation can be done on bedside. Normally if you put a linear probe onto a peripheral vein, as soon as you place your transducer on the vein, it just collapses. And the primary diagnostic criteria for deep vein thrombosis is the loss of vein compressibility. It helps to detect deep venous thrombosis, and it can be applied even to upper limbs, but often upper limb extremity is deep venous thrombosis is difficult to diagnose. The other important way to diagnose is using a nuclear venogram. In this, technetium is given peripherally, and it binds to the GP2B3A receptors which are present on the platelet surface. Now this would, if the platelets are high, that means that there is an acute DVT. So this would help you to differentiate acute from chronic or acute on chronic DVT. Okay. Now coming to echocardiography, another very important simple bedside investigation. The direct visualization of thrombus is extremely rare. You can have RA dilatation, you can have RV dilatation, you can have RV hypokinesia with apical sparing, which is called McConnell's sign. You can have abnormal motion of the interventricular septum. You can have tricuspid regurgitation, pulmonary arterial dilatation, and lack of inspiratory IVC collapse. We shall subsequently at the end of the examination being seeing all these echocardiographic features in much more detail. Now this is M mode as well as echocardiogram still from one of our patients who was a case of Eisenmenger syndrome, and the patient presented with the sudden cardiac death of the fetus intrauterine. And we found that when we did an echocardiogram, there was a thrombus which was lying in the main pulmonary artery. You can find that the patient also has got classical signs on M mode of pulmonary arterial hypertension in the form of M-shaped or a W-shaped M mode tracing of the pulmonary valve. Now this is the echocardiogram of a patient who I just showed you. I'll just go up on this and show you. Now if you see this very, just go back and see. If you see this very carefully, you will be able to see that there is a large clot which is sitting in the RA. Can you make that out? There is a large clot which is sitting in RA and is almost moving from RA to RV and coming back. This is a patient, young patient, as you see, it's a 28 years old male. Again a case of air travel associated pulmonary embolism. There is a large clot which is sitting in the RV and going into the RV. Now if this clot embolizes, this patient can have sudden cardiac death. So this is the sort of the things you can find. Very disastrous and very rare, in fact a very rare echo, and this has been published also in one of the leading journals, and very rare to find, very rare image in fact. Now coming to lung scanning, although used quite frequently, not very popular now because it requires specialized centers to do it. Basically consists of two things. One is for the ventilation, the other is for the perfusion, and what you're looking at is basically ventilation perfusion mismatch. Perfusion would not be there, but ventilation would be there. So showing you one ventilation perfusion mismatch here. If you see that when the patient has been given xenon gas, the ventilation is good. However, if you are giving technetium, the perfusion is lost. So there is a ventilation perfusion mismatch and can go to tell you that this patient has pulmonary embolism. Now coming to CT scans, quite widely available. Helical spiral CT can definitely give you the answer whether the thrombus is present or not. As far as ventilation scans are concerned, they are broadly classified into low probability, intermediate probability and high probability scans. But when you are doing a CT scan, there is no intermediate probability. Either it is present or it is absent. The sensitivity for emboli in main, lobar and segmental vessels is very high, almost reaching more than 90%. But the only drawback is that IV contrast is needed and you need to do it in a single breath hold. So these are some of the drawbacks when you are using CT scan. Another picture of, in fact two pictures of patients who have on CT scan have been picked up to have pulmonary thromboemboli sitting within the main pulmonary arteries. Patient in disaster. As far as MRI is concerned, you have gadolinium enhanced MR compatible with conventional contrast pulmonary angiogram, and the advantages are there is no ionizing radiation as compared to CT scan. No iodinated radio contrast is required as would be required either in CT scan or in a pulmonary angiogram, which is virtually risk-free and also can access RV function. The only problem is that the patients often present in emergency. So having MRI scan available round the clock is not so easy, and moreover you need experts who can reach you to the correct diagnosis. So CT scan makes more sense rather than MRI, although MRI gives you much better picture. Now coming to pulmonary angiogram, gold standard, no doubt about it. Just like coronary angiogram is the pulmonary angiogram is gold standard, because you're going to directly inject dye into the pulmonary artery and see where is the site of the block. It is not commonly performed nowadays, that is invasive, and better non-invasive techniques are available. Mortality high of the procedure per se itself is 0.5%. You have to have the anesthetist available with you, you have to have critical care specialist, you have to prevent any vasovagal reaction from occurring, so you have to be very careful while performing a pulmonary angiogram. Negative angiogram virtually excludes the diagnosis. It is most helpful when ventilation perfusion scan is negative and there is no evidence of DVT on ultrasonogram. Now this is a pulmonary angiogram. The picture which is present on your left side shows two arrows in which you can see there are filling defects. These are because of clots which are sitting in the pulmonary artery. Now this patient has subsequently been subjected to catheter directed thrombolysis and embolectomy, and you can see that both the clots are gone, and this must have been life saving in this patient because you had major obstruction. Now once you have made the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism or strongly suspected it, now comes the management.
Sir, before going to the management, once you describe very well the sign and symptoms as well as the investigation procedures.
Right.
Now it is depend upon the amount of the thrombolyzed things as well as where it is located.
Very true.
Depending on the it produce sign and symptoms. So like you described about severe symptoms like dyspnea, tachypnea and all these ECG changes. So is there any incubation period, like once it is lodged within, is it the acute, like whenever it is lodged into the pulmonary artery, immediately it will produce sign and symptoms, or is it going to take some time depending upon the condition?
Very true. No, that's a good question. Actually, this would present as a medical emergency. This will present to you emergency with acute onset breathlessness. So it will present as a medical emergency. The other entity which can present over a prolonged period of time is patients who have got chronic pulmonary thromboembolism, who have, say, some deep venous thrombosis and small amounts of fragments are embolizing gradually over a period of time. They will present over a period of months with chronic pulmonary thromboembolism. But if a patient has got an acute pulmonary thromboembolism, he is going to present to you in casualty with sudden onset breathlessness, unexplained. He has no history of asthma, there is no chest pain, patient has not been at times immobilized also, and patient has come with sudden onset breathlessness. You see the patient, he's got sinus tachycardia, he's got tachypnea, and you find everything else is normal. ECG, the chest X-ray is normal, the ECG is showing you just a sinus tachycardia. Suspect pulmonary thromboembolism, always keep it as one of your differential diagnoses. Do a serial ECG. In fact, a patient if has acute coronary syndrome can have subsequent developing myocardial infarction, so at least do 2 ECGs which are temporally apart in time. If the symptoms onset has been there for more than 4 hours, then you can do a cardiac troponin test by bedside, because that will again help you to establish the diagnosis of ACS. So high index of suspicion is required, but patient will present acutely in emergency.
Yeah.
But definitely depends upon the degree of the obstruction which has occurred.
Yeah.
If the obstruction is very small, patient might just walk away and feel he had some breathlessness, and then after that is totally fine. In fact, the air travel associated pulmonary embolism, we'll be discussing the data subsequently. It's only patients who have massive pulmonary thromboembolism will present to you. Otherwise, getting up from the aircraft and patient has been sitting for a long period of time, feels a bit breathless, he might just overlook the symptoms. Now coming to, should we go ahead to the management part?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, sir.
Now coming to the management part, it really depends upon the degree of hemodynamic compromise. Massive pulmonary thromboembolic patients are at a risk of cardiogenic shock. They should be treated very aggressively. Heparin and thrombolytic therapy are usually the treatments of choice. As far as the various invasive measures are concerned, which we shall be discussing subsequently, they are not so easily available. So the mainstay of therapy remains the heparin as well as the thrombolytic therapy. Now, since massive pulmonary thromboembolism is an important, I thought we'll cover it up more in detail. It's usually life-threatening. It presents with abrupt onset critical illness, and there is stunting progressive clinical deterioration despite therapeutic levels of anticoagulation. The incidence of massive pulmonary thromboembolism has been found to be occurring about 4% of all cases of pulmonary thromboembolism. In the international cooperative study, in which there were 2,500 patients, about 4.2% had got massive thromboembolism. Patients usually present with arterial hypotension, cardiogenic shock, systolic blood pressure is below 90, or there has been a fall of at least 40 millimeters of mercury for at least 15 minutes. It carries a very high mortality, early mortality of as high as 15%. In fact, the degree of hemodynamic compromise is the most powerful predictor of mortality. If you go by this study which was presented in JACC in 1997, if you see that if the patient had cardiogenic shock, the mortality is as high as 24.5%. If the patient had to be given CPR, mortality rates are almost reaching 65%. Whereas if the patient had only RV dysfunction and no arterial hypertension, the mortality would be 8.1%, and if patient had arterial hypertension, it's around 15%. So more the severe the degree of hemodynamic compromise, higher is the degree of mortality in massive pulmonary thromboembolism. The initial management consists of, there are different regimens which are available for giving heparin, but the most traditionally used is to give unfractionated heparin 10,000 units as a bolus, and then infusion of 1,250 units per hour to achieve an activated partial thromboplastin time of at least 80 seconds. IV fluid should be given, up to 500 to 1000 ml of IV fluid should be given. However, since there is RV dysfunction which has set in, one has to be very careful while giving the fluids. Dopamine and dobutamine are first line inotropes. They increase cardiac output without increasing pulmonary arterial pressure and thus decrease the PVR. Norepinephrine can be used. It increases cardiac output as well as systemic vascular resistance. In general, there should be a low threshold to initiate pressors. We should not wait to initiate them. If required, go ahead and start the dopamine and the dobutamine, and if required, noradrenaline can be added. At times, alpha blockers might be required, such as a phenylephrine. Now, fibrinolytic therapy, very important part of the therapy because easily available. It is a standard first line treatment, reduces the rate of death as well as recurrent pulmonary thromboembolism by 55%. Now, as far as recurrent pulmonary thromboembolism is concerned, we shall discuss it later on, but it reduces the rate of death by 55%. That is really significant. But the large amount of doses are required, prolonged treatment is required. That is why the major bleeding risk is doubled when fibrinolysis is given in massive pulmonary thromboembolism. Studies have shown that if only heparin were given, the chances of one bleeding were 12%. But if patient was given fibrinolytic therapy, the chances of bleeding are as high as 22%. Now, coming to the role of thrombolysis. Now, since the thrombolysis will physically dissolute the clot which is obstructing, the right heart failure will be prevented because that obstruction is gone. Once you are given the fibrinolytic therapy, the obstruction has been taken care of and right heart failure will be prevented. It prevents the continued release of serotonin, neurohumoral factors from the clot surface which cause pulmonary hypertension. If you remember the slide we had discussed, as far as the pathophysiology was concerned, there was one section which was dealing with the neurohumoral factors. So once the clot has been dissolved, the further release from the clot surface because of platelets of serotonin will not be there and pulmonary hypertension will not be caused. As far as the recurrence thing was concerned, these thrombolytic agents, they help to dissolve the pelvic thrombi also, and this pelvic thrombi might be a source of recurrent PE. So the recurrent chances also become less. The very good thing about thrombolytic therapy in pulmonary thromboembolism vis-a-vis thrombolytic therapy in acute MI is that the window period for giving thrombolytic therapy in pulmonary thromboembolism is 14 days. So you have a large window period, you can give thrombolytic therapy and it will be highly beneficial. It's not like an acute MI that it would only be beneficial in the first 2 to 3 hours or maximum 6 hours or maybe up to 12 hours. Here the window period is as long as 14 days. Now, what are the different agents which are available? Agents like streptokinase.
Yeah, sir, shall we stop right now because time is running out?
Sure, we can take this up in the second session.
Yeah.
After this gap?
Sure, sir.
Okay, fine.
So, dear friends, actually this is the first session and we are closing right now. I would like to request all of you, you can ask whatever you want to ask related to this topic, or you can at least inform me by SMS. My phone number, I think all of you know, that is 09810201401. At least you can inform me via SMS or via fax or via phone, wherever you are watching. So these are the some strength which will give us more inspiration to continue this program. And we will definitely meet after 15 minutes break around 12 o'clock with the same topic. Thank you very much.